Good morning and welcome to the SMU Video Archive Series. In this series, we interview members of the SMU community who can provide insight into the history of the university, especially from the perspective of their time here. I'm James Brooks, Provost Emeritus, and with us today is Elizabeth Prothro. Elizabeth, you have fulfilled a lot of roles at the university, and your family has reached across many decades. Your parents were very instrumental in a number of gifts, particularly for the seminary, and we'll talk about these in more detail in a minute. And you and your late husband Charles have been very generous also, and your son Vin and his wife Karen, who's currently a trustee of the university. So we have three generations of wonderful university support in the Perkins Prothro family, and we thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Now let me kind of reconstruct a little history for some of our younger viewers. Your parents really were involved with the university almost from its beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, we were.
I think your father, J.J. Perkins, came on the Board of Trustees in 1927. Is that right?
I'm not sure, but I think it's probably as near as we're going to get to that.
And at that time, let's see, that would have been President Bose or President Selectman, one or the other.
That was Selectman.
Yeah, Selectman must have just come in then.
I think so.
Yeah. And that was a relationship that went on then, and you yourself were a child at that point, but later in the 30s, you started at Sweetbriar and then you went to the University of Texas, but you finished here.
No, well, I went to Sweetbriar for 2 years.
Uh-huh.
And then we married, and I went down to Austin to live with my husband, but down there. But I didn't really go to the University of Texas except to get one course in order to finish my degree up here.
Oh, I see. Very good. Well, and what was your major here? What was your degree?
It was politics.
Political science.
Mm-hmm.
Who were some of the faculty people? Do you remember any of them?
No, I don't.
Okay, well, we won't pursue that then.
All right.
And you graduated in 1939?
Yeah, I was supposed to, but it was 1940.
Uh-huh, okay.
My mother pushed me very hard to graduate, and I'm glad she did.
Well, good for her. Mothers are good for things like that.
Yes, they are.
Well, now, I think you told me that you lived in Snyder Hall at that time. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the early gifts that your parents made to the university, was for at least a partial gift for the construction of Snyder Hall and perhaps the entire hall.
No, it was started by C.W. Snyder in Wichita Falls, but he only gave a small amount toward that.
I see.
And then my parents did give some of it, and that's where I lived.
Well, that was very appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
Well then, the current administration building has the name Perkins on it, and it started out as a one-story building, and then it had two significant periods of addition, the first one being the second and third floors, and your family gave the money for that gift, and that would have been in about 1938? 38,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And then later on, much later on, and this would have been around 1970, the west wing of the Perkins administration building was added. And I remember very well that your mother, and I'm sure you were here too, she was here for that rededication of that building with the addition. And I'm sure that was supported largely, if not exclusively, by your family. Am I right in that?
I don't know. I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
Yeah. Well, I just remember very well that she was here, and so I'm sure that your family was involved.
I think they were, but I can't say for sure.
Sure, I understand. And that would have been about 1969, 1970, along in there.
1970, I think it was.
Yeah. Some of this is going from memory on my part, and that's always tricky. So.
Yeah, I understand.
Well, now the gift that we remember the Perkins for largely is the Perkins School of Theology. And that started really right after the end of World War II, kind of 1946? They started talking about it. And
yeah, I remember that it started in a conversation, and they were in Oklahoma City for some meeting up there.
a Methodist meeting probably.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And Paul Martin suggested to my dad and my mother. Mother always had about as much say as he did in all this.
Good.
And they decided they'd give the theology school with the endowment and everything. Now that amount of money isn't very much as we talk about it today.
How much was that?
I think it was about $4 million.
Well, but when you translate that back to the late 1940s, that was a very, very handsome gift.
Oh, it was.
and now that built the chapel.
And all those dormitories.
Yeah, so that would be Smith Hall and Martin Hall and Perkins Hall and Hawk Hall, and then Kirby and Selectman. All that original group. The Bridwell Library we'll talk about a little bit later because that was a different gift.
But it's the same time.
Same time. Now, I think it's important to point out that prior to this time, the School of Theology had been in what is now Florence Hall, which is the south building in the Law Quadrangle. And that was where the School of Theology was. But in the late 40s, and let's see, do you remember when the buildings at the Perkins School of Theology were dedicated? Was that 49 or 50 along in there?
I think it was 51, but I could be wrong.
It was right around
that time.
And at that time then, of course, theology, two important things happened. They moved to their current location in this wonderful new quadrangle, and there was the sufficient endowment, as you pointed out, to not only build the buildings, but to build a faculty. And that was a very, very important thing, because about that time, then Dean Hawk retired, and Dean Cunningham, Merriman Cunningham, came. Do you know anything about how Merriman came to the university?
I don't think I do, but I know that he and my mother were good friends.
Before he came?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, not before he came, but after he came.
Yeah. And he really gets a lot of credit for building the quality faculty that Perkins has come to have. And we'll return to the deans a little bit later, but I wanted, because he was an important key player. And I've heard a quote from your father that reflecting the high esteem in which Paul Martin, who was your pastor in Wichita Falls.
That's right.
In which your family held him. And your dad is said to have said, if this school turns out one minister as good as Paul Martin, it will have been a good investment.
Yeah, I think he said that. I've always heard that anyway.
Yeah. Well, Paul Martin went on to become a bishop and was an important element of the university as a bishop in residence, I believe, at a later time, and one of the pillars that helped build this place. Well, now, we talked about the change in location from the north end of the campus to the south end. Do you know, Elizabeth, how who actually participated in selecting the current location of the seminary?
No, I don't. But I've heard it many a time, and I wish I could remember it. I can't. I'm sorry.
Well,
it was kind of a disagreement on the board.
Oh, really?
And then finally, it got moved to where it is now, and I think it's great.
Well, that had been a part of Arden Forest, what was called Arden Forest, which was a grove of trees in that little valley there. but it was open space all the way south from Virginia and Snyder Hall at that time. Humphrey Lee would have been president at that time. Selectman had retired in the late 30s. Humphrey Lee was president, and so the key people that were involved, in addition to your folks and Dean Hawk, would have been Humphrey Lee and I'm sure Paul Martin and Bishop A. Frank Smith, who was the chairman of the Board of Trustees, I think.
Yes, he was in the latter part of that time.
Yeah.
But I don't remember him having as much to do about it as these others you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other people that I failed to mention there?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, that was a remarkable period. Universities often grow significantly with gifts like that, and clearly that was a gift that made a huge difference in the development of this university, because that Perkins faculty and the resources represented in the Bridwell Library are not just seminary resources, they're university resources.
Yes, they are.
And a year ago we did an interview with Schubert Ogden, who you will remember, and he and I were recounting how many times he served on university committees, not seminary committees, but university committees, including the committee that brought Ken Pye here as president. He was vice chairman of that with Ray Hunt as chairman. And so that has been an extremely important piece of this university's history.
It has.
Well, another thing on the physical side of the equation, do you have any remembrances of how the decisions were made as to what buildings were to be built? That is, the chapel and the 6 other buildings. I'm sure your folks were involved in that.
Oh, I'm sure they were too, but and all the buildings came along together.
Yes.
Or part of the original gift.
Yeah.
And that's all I remember about it.
Do you know how the buildings were named?
Well, I'm sure they were named. I think my parents selected the names.
I would imagine that they would have been heavily consulted. I would think that the president and the board chairman would have done that, and that's Smith Hall and Martin Hall and Perkins Hall and Hawk Hall, and then Kirby Hall and Selectman Hall, and then, of course, the Perkins Chapel. Well, that was a magnificent gift. Are there any other aspects of it that you and I need to try to record for the record?
Aspects of what now?
Of the development of the Perkins School of Theology at that phase.
I don't think so.
Well, then moving on, there have been a number. I mean, your family has continued to give gifts to this university, not just to the seminary, over a lot of years. One of them was the renovation of the Perkins Chapel, and that was your son, Vin. I think you told me he sort of spearheaded it.
Yes, that's right. He did spearhead it, but we gave money for that too. And at the same time, I think it was all one gift, we were giving money for him to redo the grounds around the Perkins School of Theology.
Well, that was a great improvement too. And then you all were involved in the latest university campaign, which was called A Time to Lead. You made a lovely gift then, and that was for scholarships, as I recall. Is that right? Yeah. And that was, again, a family gift?
Yeah.
And then there are other things. Now, the Perkins Natatorium.
Well, that's way up there at the top,
Yeah,
early.
That was an early gift, because that was the gymnasium before it became a natatorium. And so that came along before the seminary did.
Yeah, I think it's about 1938.
Yeah. Well, I've gotten them a little bit out of chronology here.
Well, that's why I made a list. I'm not sure either about it, but.
Well, now do you have other gifts there that we ought to mention? Because there are so many things that your family has done, and we want to try to chronicle as many as we can.
Well, I think that's about all of them I can think of right now.
Someone told me that your family had contributed to the air conditioning of Moody Coliseum. Is that?
I don't think so.
Okay, that's a part of the myth that needs to be corrected.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the other initial building in the Perkins quadrangle, so-called, was Bridwell Library.
Yeah.
Talk about Joe Bridwell and your folks.
Well,
I'm sure there was a very close connection.
Well, we used to live about one door from them, 2 doors actually. And Mrs. Bridwell never would have any part of anything. She just was a stay-at-home.
Uh-huh.
But we were longtime friends of his, and well, let me see. Anyway, after Miss Bridwell died, he always said that he and Margaret gave things, but I don't think Margaret had much to do with it, other than her name was on where the money came from. And she just was kind of she came down here one time to see the School of Theology, and that was it.
But he was down here many times.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Because I remember being at an occasion when it was a collection was being dedicated, and he was on the platform with Deckard Turner and Claude Albritton, who was then Dean of Libraries, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, but talk a little bit more about Mr. Bridwell. He was a rancher, wasn't he?
Well, partly.
Yeah.
But he built this huge home in Wichita Falls, and he was a kind of a hail fellow, well met. You know, he was always anxious and just saying a lot and into things. I liked him. He was real nice, but.
Well, how did he get interested in libraries?
Well, my mother pushed him into it.
Well, good. Your mother did many good things.
Yeah, she did.
So he really, after she got him interested in it, he really became genuinely interested in it, I think.
I think so.
That was my impression.
That's my
I was not
impression.
closely involved with him, but just watching him, it sounded to me that was the case.
He always wanted to get his daughter Margaret into it, and she just, as I said before, just was
Went along with it. Well, now you and Charles contributed. Well, you and Charles both contributed a lot to the Bridwell Library because you have a deep love of books yourself.
Yes, I do.
And when did you get interested in books?
Well, I think I've always been interested in reading in that, and about 1960, my husband gave me my first 5 rare books, and that really got me going.
Now, these were Bibles?
Yes, and Deckard Turner he came here in 1950
Right.
as a librarian.
Director of the Bridwell Library.
Yeah, and I used to go by there anytime I was on campus, and I was on campus quite a bit in those days.
Yes, you were.
And I'd go by to see Deckard.
And Deckard could get anybody interested in books.
Yes, he could.
He was a remarkable wizard. He really was. Well, then talk about the Bible collection, because that was a very important gift to Bridwell Library.
Yes, I think it was. I collected books from, we've had them down there a little before 1996. We put them down there so they could be available.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1996, I gave them to Bridwell Library. But I just collected them all along. It was my life, I think, for a long time.
And how many did you have altogether when you finally made your gift?
Well, I meant to look that up, and I forgot. But
It was around 500, wasn't it?
Almost, not quite.
Yeah. I know it was an amazing collection, and a wonderful, wonderful gift. And now, you've given other gifts to Bridwell Library too, haven't you?
Well, Charles gave the room where they have displays down there.
That's right, the gallery,
Gallery down there.
viewing gallery. Yeah, that was a lovely gift, because there are so many treasures in Perkins of all kinds, not just your Bibles, but certainly including them. And without that viewing space, a lot of people didn't have any idea, any way of knowing what we had there.
That's right.
And that was a very important gift. Well, are there any other dimensions of the Bridwell Library that you want to comment on? I want to get on and talk about your work as chair of the Trustee Committee on Libraries a little bit later, but specifically on Bridwell or Perkins in general, are there any things that you and I have left out in our conversation thus far?
Well, I don't think so.
Okay.
Do you have this renovation of Perkins Chapel?
I was going to get to that next.
All right.
Let's go ahead and talk about that. That's a good time to do it. And then I want to talk about some of the leadership over the years, the deans and Deckard and so on. But the renovation of Perkins Chapel was that was late 90s, right?
1999.
Yes, and that was a another beautiful contribution. Why don't you talk about a little bit about that from your point of view, in terms of you and your family deciding to do that?
Well, I think Vin was the one that pushed us into that.
Mm-hmm.
He and Karen got very interested in SMU, and the chapel was one of the prime things.
Yes?
Vin used to be down there working around on the grounds doing things himself.
Really?
Mm-hmm. He was physically interested in it.
Well, good.
But, and then we gave money to redo, I spoke about that, redo the grounds around there. And I think that's about all I can tell you about that.
Well, the chapel has been an awfully important, because it's a chapel for the seminary, but it's also a university chapel.
That's right.
2 of my 3 daughters were married in Perkins Chapel.
Oh, were they?
And a lot of people can tell stories like that. It's very much of a community asset, and is a beautifully designed, architecturally perfect building, and the renovation of it has just simply enhanced it beyond its original beauty. And so that was a wonderful contribution. Let's talk a little bit about the various deans that we've mentioned. Dean Hawk, who was the first theology dean that your family dealt with, I think. And then he was followed by Merriman Cunningham, and we've talked a little bit about Merriman. I've talked a little bit about Merriman, but you may very well have some comments, because he had a lot of dealings with your family.
With Mother in particular.
Yeah.
Well, of course, my knowledge of what went on down here kind of was going on during that period of time. I was raising my children, instead of.
You had other things on your mind.
Yes, I did.
Well, Merriman, as we said, built that faculty, and he had a very a public persona, let me put it that way. And I think I mentioned to you in our conversation the other day, when the university was smaller, at the opening faculty meeting every year, all the deans would introduce their new faculty, and it was always a contest between Merriman and Bob Story, who was dean of the law school, as to who could be the most flamboyant in their introductions of the new faculty. And so Merriman was quite a showman, but he also had exquisitely good taste in terms of picking quality people. Mm-hmm. Now he was followed by Joe Quillian, and you had dealings with Joe.
Yes, I did.
And Joe was a very effective follow-on to Merriman from our point of view here on the campus. And I know that as I said, you had a lot of relationships with Joe. Any particular ones that stand out?
I don't think so. He and my mother were good friends, and my father was not active in those days. Mm-hmm. I think he was still living, but Joe Quillian was just a promoter, is what I'd call him.
Well, he was very good at that.
Yes, he was.
Joe had that soft Georgia accent, and and he knew how to use it.
Yes, he did.
And then there have been subsequent deans. Jim Kirby came along, and you knew and worked with Jim too. Mm-hmm. And I think all of them have maintained the quality of that seminary that was really built by your folks' initial gift. And at least I know they've worked hard to do that. And Robin Lovin and currently Bill Lawrence. Mm-hmm. Well, let's return and talk a little bit more about Deckard Turner, because Deckard was director of that library for many years.
He came in 1950.
And left when in the 80s, I think, went to the Human Resources Center and at the University of Texas.
We all tried to get him not to go, and
That's right.
And he went anyway.
He went anyway. I know I worked hard on that too.
I think he was kind of, later was just, wished he hadn't gone.
Yeah.
But he never did say so.
Well, that would have been too much. Mm-hmm. But Deckard had a real gift for identifying important collections of books, and then finding ways to secure help in acquiring them. Mm-hmm. And your family was very generous in that, and the Bridwells were too.
Yeah.
And other people, but the two of you were the principal benefactors there.
I think so.
Yeah.
Mr. Bridwell was very good at buying various collections as he found them, as Deckard found them.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know any way of commenting on their relationship, but as far as I was concerned, I thought Deckard was a good friend of mine. And after he came here, anytime I was on campus, well, I think I said this before, I'd stop by to see him and we'd have a visit.
Yeah, and he was a good person to visit with. Mm-hmm. Very interesting conversationalist.
Yes, he was.
I've told you that one of the first things that happened to me when I became provost, the vice president treasurer's office was right across the hall, and he came storming into my office waving a fistful of papers. And this was Deckard's expense account for a buying trip to London. And the vice president treasurer didn't quite understand how the world of rare books works. And so we had to do some education. Because I was on Deckard's side on that.
I don't blame you, I would be too.
Anyway, now, Deckard really traveled all over the world buying books. Literally, he would find
he did.
collections and then go and persuade people to buy them, and made a great contribution in that way. And that leads into something you did that was very important, and where you and I really worked more closely together, and that was your role as chair of the University Trustee Library Committee. And you chaired that committee for a good number of years.
Yes, but I don't remember how many.
I don't either, but you were chair for at least a dozen years, I want to say. And talk a little bit about that, if you can. Some of the things that you felt like were accomplished at that time, and that you felt like you had a role in, and so on.
That gets to be a little difficult.
Well, we won't push it beyond the limits.
Well, I just think it was. I don't know what I can say about that.
Well, let me talk a little bit about it, because I had the good fortune as provost to work with you on that, and I had a great blessing when I was in the provost office, because I had you to work with in libraries and Stanley DeMarcus to work with in academic affairs, and you both gave us a lot of support, and yet you were both very frank to call to our attention things that needed to be attended to, and I appreciated that. Now, we created a position of Dean of Libraries during that time, and Charles Richardson was the first person to hold that, and then shortly Claude Albritton became Dean of Libraries. And it was during that period that we made a very, very important acquisition for the university libraries, and that was the DeGolyer collection. And I don't know how closely you've been able to stay in touch with that, but that has developed to be a tremendous asset, like the Bridwell. And SMU is known all over the world for those two libraries among knowledgeable people. And we have a fine, relatively new director of the DeGolyer Library, Russell Martin, and I don't know whether you've had a chance to get to know him, but you know Dean McCombs, who is the Dean of Central University Libraries. And so those were all contributions, and you gave a lot of help in very subtle, low-key ways during that whole period, mostly by you used to show up in libraries and want to see what was there.
I did.
And I found that very helpful, and I know the librarians did too. They may have been a little startled when you showed up, but but that was all right too. Anyway, during that time also, we created collectively, you and the deans of libraries and I created what was called Colophon, Friends of the University Libraries.
I had a big part in that.
You had a big part in that. And I think that idea came from Deckard, because we were trying to make sure that it was all university libraries, Bridwell and Law and the Central University Libraries, all involved in it, because we wanted an organization that would support all of the libraries in the university as appropriate. And you all certainly accomplished that. I remember that you and Charles used to fly down for those Colophon meetings and then fly back the same day. And that was very much appreciated. Any other memories on the Colophon thing?
No, I can't think of anything particularly. I'm kind of drawing a blank.
Yeah, well, that's all right. And you did one other thing that was unofficial, but I've always thought of it as a very important thing. A lot of people do not know that you are also an accomplished photographer. And the University Women's Club, I think, at that period, and this would have been in the early 80s, I think.
I believe so.
Yeah, decided to produce a coffee table book on SMU.
SMU Reflections.
SMU Reflections. And you did the photography for that. And it was color photography, as I recall. And you had all dimensions of the campus. I don't know how many images you took, but there are probably at least 100 in the book.
I don't remember how many I took either, but I enjoyed doing that. There were two other people I worked with. They didn't do the photography. I did that. But it was fun. I enjoyed that.
Do you remember you worked with Bonnie Hillerbrand and Donna Salacuse? Yes, two dean's wives. Well, a provost wife and a dean's wife. And I guess they did the text that went along with the photography. And I always regretted that book wasn't kept in print.
Well, there was some reason why it came out at the wrong time. Something was going on here on the campus.
I don't know.
I don't either. Maybe I can think back and remember that later, but I don't remember.
Well, we'll do a plug right here that it ought to be revised and updated with some of the new buildings put in, but your photographs in there are really superb photographs.
Well, thank you.
And you used to do your own Christmas cards too, that would be your photographs.
I still do.
Do you?
I don't go out and take them anymore, but I go back through my slides and find them.
Well, I've seen a number of those, and they're quite beautiful.
Well, thank you.
Well, Elizabeth, we're...
I'm going to have to go.
I know that you're running out of time, and so am I. And I just want to thank you very much for making the effort to come down and do this with us. And you and your family have been a very important piece of the history of this university. And it was important to get you and your recollections preserved for people who haven't had the opportunity to know you. And I thank you.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.
Just a minute.